So you buy some land, put a caravan on it, maybe open a small campsite. Then you've got somewhere to live. However, every step that looks simple turns into another layer of planning permission, licenses, conditions, insurances and delays. Even after buying the land, you may still discover you don't have the right to live there, and certainly don't have the right to let other people stay there. How much control do you really gain when you buy the land if someone else still decides how you can use it? Living on the road, Waterways, off-grid in the UK, Dicky Dread. This is part 24 of the video series, and we're in chapter 3, living on the land or water, parking up and planning reality. So today we're going to cover campsites and static caravans. So campsites, a formal route into land use. One of the clearer ways to use land for habitation without building a permanent dwelling is to operate it as a campsite. Unlike informal occupation, this brings the activity within a recognised legal framework. However, it's not a loophole. It's a regulated use with defined limits. In England and Wales, most land used for caravans or camping is regulated under the Caravan Sites and Controller Development Act 1960. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, equivalent but separate legislation applies, including the Caravans Act Northern Ireland 2011, alongside their own planning systems. In all cases, the basic position is similar. Most campsite use requires planning permission for change of use of the land and a site licence from the local authority. These two elements work together. A site licence will not normally be granted without planning permission, and planning permission alone does not authorise operation. So limited exceptions. There are small numbers of situations where a full site licence is not required. The first one is what's called the 28-day rule, and this applies in England and Wales. Land can be used for camping or caravans for up to 28 days per year without a site licence. This is a temporary allowance and does not permit continuous or residential occupation. Scotland and Northern Ireland operate different temporary use allowances, and the 28-day rule should not be assumed to apply in the same way. Exempted organisations. Certain bodies, such as the Camping and Caravanning Club and the Caravan and Motorhome Club, can certify land for small-scale camping without a full site licence. These sites are typically limited in size and must operate within the organisation's rules. Incidental use and land-based activity. In some cases, limited camping linked to agriculture or forestry may be tolerated, but this is a narrow and fact-specific, should not be assumed to allow residential use. England and Wales, planning context. The basic legal structure is similar in both countries, but the policy context differs. In England, campsite development is considered under the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 and local plans, alongside permitted development rights for temporary use. In Wales, decisions are guided by Planning Policy Wales and Technical Advice Note 13, with greater emphasis on landscape impact, sustainability and rural policy. In both cases, applications will usually turn on access, sanitation, environmental impact, traffic and cumulative effect of use. Scotland and Northern Ireland follow the same broad principles of planning control, but decisions are made under separate legislation and policy frameworks and may be applied more restrictively in rural areas. Living on site. Operating a campsite does not automatically create a right to live on the site on the land. Where residential occupation is allowed is normally granted as a site manager's dwelling or occupational need. This means the occupation must be necessary for running the site. It is tied to the business, not the individual. It is controlled by planning condition or occupancy tie, and it may be limited to a caravan or temporary structure. Local authorities will usually expect clear justification, such as the scale of the site or the need for constant supervision. Smaller or seasonal sites often do not meet the threshold. If the business use stops, the right to live on the land will usually fall away with it. Insurance and liability. Operating a campsite also brings liability. While not always set out as a standalone planning requirement, public liability insurance is typically expected in practice, particularly where members of the public are using the land. This covers risks such as injury, fire and property damage. In many cases, insurers will require evidence of planning permission, site licensing, fire safety measures, and basic infrastructure before providing cover. Without insurance, operating even a small site can expose the landowner to significant financial and legal risk. As a rough guide, small low-impact sites may pay a few £100s per year for basic public liability cover, while larger or higher risk sites can run into the low thousands annually. Costs depend heavily on scale, facilities, fire risk, and whether the site is seasonal or permanent. When I looked into it, I was going to do it on my land here. It worked out about £4.50 a month. Practical reality. Campsites are sometimes presented as a way to live on your land. In practice, they are better understood as controlled land use that may, in limited cases, support tied occupation. They sit firmly within the system described in this chapter. Used properly, they can provide a lawful base and income. Used informally or allowed to drift into permanent residence, they tend to attract attention quickly because they are visible, regulated, and easy to access against clear rules. Timescales and process reality. One of the least discussed aspects of land-based living is how long the process can take. Planning, licensing and enforcement do not operate on personal timelines. They move at their own pace, often slowly and sometimes unpredictably. A straightforward application may take several months. More complex cases, particularly those involving rural dwellings, change of use or appeals can extend over years. It is not unusual for a proposal to go through multiple iterations, refusals and resubmissions before reaching a stable income. During that time, circumstances can change. Policies are updated, local priorities shift, and the way a site is perceived may evolve. What appears viable at the start may become more difficult, or occasionally easier as the process unfolds. There's also a personal dimension to this. Delays affect not just plans, but finances, energy, and day-to-day life. Holding land without being able to use it as intended can be costly. Living in uncertainty can be draining. For many people, this is the point at which projects stall or are abandoned. What tends to make the difference is not speed, but sustainability. Approaches that allow for delay financially, practically, and mentally are more likely to succeed than those that depend on a quick outcome. In practice, the process rewards persistence and consistency more than urgency. It is less a single decision than a sequence of interactions over time. Now I'm going to static caravans, ownership and the right to stay. Buying a static caravan on a site can look like a straightforward way to secure a base. In practice, ownership of a caravan and the right to occupy the pitch are two separate things. Most sites operate on a license agreement rather than ownership of land. This means you own the caravan itself, you pay fees to keep it on the site, and your right to stay is governed by the site rules and license terms. The legal framework varies depending on the type of site. In England and Wales, key legislation, including the Caravan Sites and Controller Development Act 1960, and for residential sites, the Mobile Homes Act 1983. Scotland and Northern Ireland operate under separate but broadly similar legal frameworks, with their own site licensing and residential protections. So holiday sites versus residential sites. The most important distinction is between holiday use and residential use. Holiday sites. Most static caravans are located on holiday parks. These are not authorised for permanent residents. Typical conditions include closed seasons, you must leave for part of the year, restrictions on using the caravan as your main home, and planning conditions limiting occupation to holiday use. Even if these rules are loosely enforced in practice, they remain legally binding. Residential sites. Some sites have full residential status, often referred to as park home sites. On these sites, year-round occupation is permitted. Residents may have stronger legal protection under the Mobile Homes Act 1983, and agreements are more formalised, with defined rights and obligations. However, these sites are fewer in number and usually more tightly regulated. The detail of these protections varies between England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but the core distinction between holiday use and residential occupation applies across all parts of the UK. Practical reality. Buying a static caravan does not by itself create a right to live on land. On holiday sites, long-term or full-time occupation often sits in a grey area between tolerance and breach of planning conditions. This can continue for some time, but it can also be enforced if visibility increases or site management changes. On residential sites, occupation is more secure, but it comes with formal rules, fees and oversight. As with campsites, the key distinction is between possession and permission. You may own the structure, but your ability to stay depends on the legal status of the site and the conditions attached to it. So whether you're opening a campsite, waiting for planning permission or buying a static caravan, the same principles keep appearing. Ownership is only one part of the equation. Much of modern land use isn't controlled by who owns the land, but what you're permitted to do with it, which means the real issue may not be campsites, caravans or planning applications. Maybe how society decides who is allowed to live outside conventional housing, as we keep saying. Are we regulating development or regulating alternative ways of living? So next up, we're on chapter 3, still living on the land or water, parking up and planning reality. I'm going to cover the agricultural route and field to farm reality.